I know this is difficult, but we must face the truth. The truth is, my father wanted me to have it.
That's impossible.
He made his wishes clear. Here are some wonderful books for you.
Thank you so much.
We have plenty more supplies over here. We all know why you're here.
Okay.
I am his wife. That's what you claim.
Yeah.
But we know the truth. The time is now. This legacy is ours.
The cruelest thing about being unwanted is that everyone assumes you belong somewhere else. Naomi Carter heard those words once from her grandfather when she was a little girl. And years later, standing beneath the sparkling chandeliers of the Whitmore estate, she realized how true they were. The mansion stretched across nearly 12,000 square feet on a hill overlooking the city, glowing with warm lights as luxury vehicles filled the circular driveway. Inside, laughter echoed through marble hallways, while waiters carried silver trays between guests dressed in designer suits and elegant gowns. It was Richard Whitmore's 68th birthday celebration, one of the most anticipated social events of the season, attended by business executives, politicians, and longtime family friends. Naomi adjusted the sleeve of her navy blue dress and forced a polite smile as she stepped into the grand ballroom beside her husband, Ethan Whitmore. Almost immediately, conversations shifted. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to be felt. Eyes glanced toward her before quickly looking away. Smiles faded. Whispers began. She had been married to Ethan for 4 years, yet many members of the Whitmore family still acted as if she were a temporary visitor who had accidentally wandered into their world. Margaret Whitmore, Ethan's mother, stood near the center of the room greeting guests. When her gaze landed on Naomi, her expression tightened for a fraction of a second before she turned away and embraced another guest with enthusiasm. Naomi pretended not to notice. She had become an expert at pretending. Pretending the comments did not sting. Pretending the cold greetings did not matter. Pretending she did not hear relatives wonder aloud how someone from her background had managed to marry into one of the wealthiest families in the state. Ethan squeezed her hand briefly before drifting toward a group of investors discussing business opportunities. Naomi remained alone near a window overlooking the gardens. It was a familiar position, close enough to be included, distant enough to be forgotten. Then a voice interrupted her thoughts. "There you are." Richard Whitmore approached, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. Unlike everyone else, his smile always seemed genuine. "I was beginning to think you were hiding from me." Naomi laughed softly. "I think it's the other way around." Richard handed her a glass. "Then let them hide. Their loss." For a moment, the noise of the ballroom seemed to fade. Richard never treated her like an outsider. He asked about her work, remembered details from previous conversations, and listened when she spoke. It was a small kindness, but in a family where approval felt like a guarded treasure, it meant more than anyone realized. Across the room, Naomi noticed Margaret watching them. Her expression was unreadable. Richard followed Naomi's gaze and sighed quietly. "One day," he said, staring into the crowd, "people reveal who they really are when they think there is something to gain." Naomi frowned. "What does that mean?" Richard smiled, but there was something thoughtful behind it. "Just an observation." Before she could ask another question, guests gathered near the stage for Richard's speech. The room erupted into applause as he walked forward. Naomi joined in, unaware that this celebration would be the last birthday Richard Whitmore would ever celebrate, and that the quiet words he spoke that evening would soon change the course of her life forever. 3 weeks after the birthday celebration, Naomi found herself replaying Richard Whitmore's final words over and over again. First, life appeared to continue normally. Richard remained active in his business affairs, attended meetings, and exchanged occasional phone calls with Naomi, often asking simple questions about her day. Then everything changed on a quiet Tuesday morning. Naomi was organizing files at work when her phone vibrated. The screen showed Ethan's name. The moment she answered, she knew something was wrong. His voice sounded distant and strained. He told her that Richard had suffered a sudden medical emergency earlier that morning. Within hours, the entire Whitmore family gathered at the hospital. Naomi arrived as quickly as she could, her heart pounding with disbelief. The waiting area was crowded with relatives, executives, and longtime family friends. Some were crying. Others were already discussing practical matters. Naomi noticed how quickly conversations shifted from concern to questions about company leadership and future ownership. She sat quietly near a window, unable to focus on anything except the possibility that Richard might never walk through another doorway again. Late that afternoon, the family received the news everyone had feared. Richard Whitmore had passed away. A heavy silence settled across the room. Naomi lowered her head and closed her eyes. Memories flooded her mind. The birthday celebration, the conversations, the kindness he had consistently shown her when few others had bothered. For several minutes, she could not move. Ethan stood nearby, staring blankly at the floor. Margaret remained composed, accepting condolences from a growing line of visitors. Over the next several days, the Whitmore estate became the center of constant activity. Luxury vehicles filled the driveway from sunrise until late evening. Floral arrangements arrived by the dozens. Reporters waited beyond the gates, hoping to capture statements from family members. During the memorial service, Richard was praised as a visionary businessman, a generous philanthropist, and a respected leader. Naomi listened carefully to every speech, yet she could not ignore a growing feeling that something had changed within the family. Conversations seemed different now, more calculated, more guarded. During private gatherings, relatives whispered behind closed doors. People who rarely visited Richard during his final years suddenly spoke passionately about preserving his legacy. Naomi observed everything quietly. One evening after the service, she entered a sitting room and unintentionally overheard a conversation between two distant relatives. They were discussing percentages, properties, and corporate shares. Neither mentioned Richard as a father, friend, or husband. They spoke about him as if he were an estate to be divided. Naomi left before they noticed her. The following week brought even more strange developments. Ethan became increasingly distracted. Margaret spent hours meeting privately with attorneys and financial advisors. Several family members who had barely acknowledged Naomi before now watched her with unusual curiosity. She could not understand why. Then, while helping organize sympathy cards in Richard's study, Naomi noticed something she had never seen before. Resting beside a framed family photograph was a small brass key attached to a simple leather tag. Her breath caught instantly. She recognized it. Months earlier, Richard had quietly placed that exact key in her hand during a private conversation and told her to keep it safe until the right time came. At the time, she thought little of it. Now, staring at the empty space where it should have been, Naomi felt an unexpected chill. For the first time since Richard's death, she began to wonder whether his final plans involved far more than anyone in the Whitmore family realized. The days that followed felt different in ways Naomi could not fully explain. The Whitmore estate remained busy, but the atmosphere had shifted from grief to calculation. Every conversation seemed to carry an invisible purpose. Every smile felt measured. Every invitation sounded like a question waiting for an answer. One afternoon, Naomi arrived at the estate after receiving a message from Ethan asking her to join a family meeting. As she entered the library, she immediately sensed tension in the room. Margaret sat at the head of a long table surrounded by several relatives. Financial reports, legal documents, and folders were spread across the polished surface. Conversations stopped the moment Naomi walked in. No one offered a greeting. No one invited her to sit. Margaret finally broke the silence. Her voice remained calm, but there was a sharpness beneath every word. She explained that the family was discussing important matters concerning Richard's companies, properties, and charitable foundations. Naomi nodded politely and prepared to leave, assuming the discussion did not involve her. Before she could turn around, one of the relatives spoke. He casually remarked that it was surprising how often Richard had spent time with Naomi during the last few years. Another relative added that Richard rarely trusted people outside. the immediate family. The comments sounded innocent on the surface, but Naomi recognized what they really were. Questions disguised as observations. Suspicion hidden behind politeness. She answered honestly. Richard had occasionally asked for her help with community projects and charity events. Nothing more. The room remained unconvinced. Over the following week, similar conversations continued. Family members suddenly seemed interested in every interaction Naomi had ever shared with Richard. They asked where they met, what they discussed, and how often they spoke. Even Ethan began asking unusual questions. At first, Naomi dismissed it as stress caused by loss. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. One evening, she overheard Margaret speaking with a cousin in the hallway. They did not realize Naomi was nearby. Margaret's voice carried clearly through the partially open door. She said that some people knew exactly how to gain the sympathy of powerful men. The cousin responded by mentioning Naomi's name. A few seconds later, both women laughed quietly. Naomi stood frozen. The words hurt more than she expected. For years she had endured cold treatment and subtle judgment, but this felt different. This felt deliberate. Later that night, Ethan attempted to reassure her. He insisted that emotions were running high and that everyone was simply trying to understand Richard's final intentions. Yet even as he spoke, Naomi sensed uncertainty in his eyes. For the first time since their marriage, she wondered whether Ethan truly trusted her. The next morning, a letter arrived at the estate from the law office handling Richard's affairs. Margaret opened it during breakfast. As she read the contents, her expression tightened. Several relatives immediately demanded details. Margaret announced that the formal reading of Richard's will would take place soon and that all relevant parties were expected to attend. The room erupted with speculation. Naomi quietly lowered her gaze toward her coffee cup. Across the table, Margaret looked directly at her for several long seconds before saying something that caused the entire room to fall silent. She said she hoped everyone attending had honest reasons for being there. Although no name was mentioned, every eye in the room turned toward Naomi. Rain began falling shortly after sunset, tapping softly against the tall windows of the Whitmore estate. Naomi stood alone in the guest bedroom she had shared with Ethan during countless family gatherings. A partially packed suitcase rested on the bed beside her. She had not planned to leave that evening, but the atmosphere inside the mansion had become unbearable. Every conversation stopped when she entered a room. Every glance carried suspicion. Even the staff seemed uncertain how to treat her. Downstairs, another family meeting was underway. Voices drifted through the hallways as relatives debated financial matters that seemed to grow more urgent each day. Naomi zipped her suitcase and took a deep breath. She intended to spend a few days at her apartment until emotions settled. Before she could leave, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Margaret entered without waiting for an invitation. Her expression was cold and controlled. Behind her stood two relatives who remained silent. Naomi immediately sensed trouble. Margaret glanced at the suitcase and folded her arms. She said perhaps leaving was the best decision Naomi had made in weeks. Naomi calmly replied that she simply wanted space. Margaret stepped farther into the room. Then years of restrained resentment finally surfaced. She accused Naomi of manipulating Richard's trust. She claimed Richard had become distant from parts of the family because of outside influences. Although Margaret never presented evidence, she spoke as if every suspicion were already proven fact. Naomi tried to defend herself. She reminded Margaret that Richard had always made his own decisions. She reminded her that kindness was not manipulation, but reason no longer mattered. The conversation grew increasingly painful. Relatives gathered in the hallway, listening openly. Some nodded in agreement with Margaret's accusations. Others watched silently without offering support. Naomi searched for Ethan, hoping he would step forward. Instead, he stood several feet away near the staircase. His face revealed uncertainty, rather than conviction. He did not accuse her, but he did not defend her either. That silence hurt more than any insult. Margaret finally declared that until the reading of the will was complete, Naomi should stay away from the estate and from family affairs. The statement was delivered as if it were a formal decision. No one challenged it. Naomi slowly picked up her suitcase. Her hands trembled slightly, but she refused to let anyone see tears forming in her eyes. Without another word, she walked toward the front entrance. The massive wooden doors opened. Cool rain filled the air. Water shimmered beneath the estate lights as thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. Naomi stepped onto the front drive carrying the only belongings she had brought for the weekend. Behind her, the doors closed. No one followed. No one called her name. Standing beneath the rain, Naomi suddenly remembered the small brass key Richard had once given her. It remained safely stored inside her purse. For reasons she could not explain, she reached inside and wrapped her fingers around it. The metal felt cold, yet somehow it brought a strange sense of reassurance. As she walked toward her car, another memory surfaced. Months earlier, Richard had looked directly at her and said that difficult days often arrive before important truths. At the time, the words seemed mysterious. Now, with rain falling around her and her future more uncertain than ever, Naomi wondered whether Richard had known this moment was coming all along. Naomi spent the next 2 days in her small apartment on the edge of the city, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The silence felt strange after weeks of constant activity at the Whitmore estate. She barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the mansion doors closing behind her and remembered Ethan standing there without saying a word. On the third morning, sunlight filtered through her living room window as she sat at the kitchen table staring at the brass key resting beside a cup of untouched coffee. She had carried it for months without ever questioning why Richard had entrusted it to her. At the time, he had simply smiled and told her that one day she would know exactly what to do with it. Those words now echoed in her mind with growing urgency. Naomi picked up the key and studied it carefully. The leather tag attached to it contained only 3 faded letters.
WCH.
She had never paid attention to them before. Curious, she searched through old emails and documents, hoping the initials might mean something. Hours passed without answers. Then a memory surfaced. Nearly a year earlier, Richard had invited her to accompany him to a charity event outside the city. During the drive, he had mentioned a place called Whitmore Community House, a small nonprofit center funded privately for local families in need. Naomi suddenly sat upright. The initials matched perfectly. Without allowing herself time to second-guess the idea, she grabbed her purse and drove across town. The building stood in a quiet neighborhood nearly 30 miles from the Whitmore estate. Unlike the luxury properties associated with the family name, this place was modest and welcoming. Children played on a nearby basketball court while volunteers organized supplies inside. Naomi entered and introduced herself to the elderly receptionist. The woman's expression immediately brightened. She asked whether Naomi was the person Mr. Whitmore had spoken about. Naomi felt her pulse quicken. Before she could ask what that meant, the receptionist disappeared into a back office and returned carrying a small wooden box. Attached to the top was an envelope bearing Naomi's name in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a brief note. Richard wrote that if Naomi was reading the letter, events had unfolded exactly as he expected. He apologized for the burden he was placing on her and instructed her to use the key to open the box. Naomi inserted the key into the brass lock. Turned smoothly. Inside were several documents, photographs, and a sealed folder marked confidential. Most surprising of all was a second handwritten message. Richard explained that the contents must remain private until after the formal reading of his will. He emphasized that revealing anything too early could create serious problems. Naomi carefully returned everything to the box. Her mind raced with questions. What was Richard trying to protect? Why had he trusted her instead of someone from his own family? As she prepared to leave, her phone suddenly rang. The caller identification displayed a name she had been expecting and dreading at the same time. Benjamin Foster, the Whitmore family attorney. Naomi answered. His voice was professional but unusually serious. He informed her that the official reading of Richard Whitmore's will had been scheduled for the following afternoon and that her presence was specifically required. Before ending the call, he added one final sentence. He said Mr. Whitmore had left very clear instructions regarding Naomi Carter, and everyone would soon understand why. The following afternoon, Naomi arrived at the law offices of Foster and Grant 15 minutes early. The building stood in the financial district, surrounded by glass towers and busy streets, but inside the conference room everything felt unnaturally still. A long mahogany table occupied the center of the room. Family members had already begun arriving. Margaret sat near the front with a confident expression. Several relatives gathered around her, quietly discussing estimates of company valuations and property holdings. Ethan entered a few minutes later. His eyes met Naomi's briefly before he looked away. The distance between them felt wider than the length of the room. As Naomi took a seat near the end of the table, conversation slowed. A few relatives exchanged knowing looks. Others seemed openly annoyed by her presence. One cousin even muttered that some people clearly enjoyed staying close to money. Naomi ignored the comment and remained silent. She had promised herself she would not react. At exactly 2 o'clock, Benjamin Foster entered carrying a thick leather folder. The room immediately fell quiet. He greeted everyone, took his seat, and explained that Richard Whitmore had left detailed instructions regarding the administration of his estate. Benjamin emphasized that every provision would be read exactly as written. No interruptions would be permitted. Margaret nodded confidently. She appeared certain that the process would simply confirm what the family already expected. Benjamin began with several charitable donations. Significant amounts were allocated to hospitals, educational programs, and community organizations. Naomi recognized the name Whitmore Community House among the beneficiaries. Her heart skipped slightly, but she revealed nothing. The attorney continued reading. Certain properties were distributed among family members. Business interests were assigned according to carefully prepared legal structures. Investment accounts were divided. Several relatives smiled as their names appeared. Others looked disappointed when they received less than expected. Throughout the process, Naomi noticed something unusual. Richard's decisions seemed incredibly deliberate. Every allocation appeared designed for a specific purpose rather than simple wealth distribution. Nearly an hour passed. Eventually Margaret leaned back in her chair with visible satisfaction. Ethan appeared relieved. Most of the estate had already been addressed. Several family members exchanged quiet smiles as if the outcome had been settled. Then Benjamin closed one folder and opened another. The movement immediately captured Naomi's attention. This folder looked different from the others. Its cover was worn from handling, and a handwritten note was attached to the front. Benjamin adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. He announced that the remaining provisions involved personal instructions that Richard had specifically ordered to be read after all financial matters were completed. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Margaret frowned slightly. One relative checked his watch. Another sighed impatiently. Benjamin ignored them and continued. He explained that Richard had personally recorded statements and written letters intended to accompany the final section of his estate plan. Several people looked confused. Margaret asked why such measures were necessary. Benjamin calmly replied that Richard believed certain truths would only be understood if everyone heard them together. The room grew silent again. Naomi felt her pulse begin to rise. Without realizing it, her hand moved toward her purse where the brass key remained hidden. Benjamin carefully removed a sealed envelope bearing Richard Whitmore's signature. He placed it on the table in front of him and looked around the room. Then he said that what came next would likely surprise everyone present. Benjamin carefully opened the envelope and removed several pages written in Richard Whitmore's own hand. The room remained silent as he began reading. Richard's words immediately felt different from the legal language everyone had heard throughout the afternoon. He spoke directly to the people gathered around the table. He thanked them for attending and expressed his hope that they would listen with open minds. Then his message took an unexpected turn. Richard explained that during the final years of his life, he had spent considerable time observing not only how people treated him, but how they treated others when they believed no reward would follow. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Margaret folded her arms. Benjamin continued reading. Richard described visiting charitable organizations, community programs, and local projects without public attention. He explained that these visits allowed him to witness character in its most honest form. Wealth, he wrote, often reveals ambition. Difficulty reveals integrity. Naomi lowered her eyes as memories began returning. She remembered accompanying Richard to community centers, educational programs, and food drives. At the time, she believed he was simply supporting causes he cared about. Now she wondered whether he had been watching something else entirely. Benjamin turned to the next page. Richard stated that over several years he had documented observations concerning individuals both inside and outside his family. At that moment, confusion spread around the room. Ethan leaned forward. One cousin exchanged nervous glances with another. Then Benjamin reached into the folder and removed a small digital recorder. He explained that Richard had specifically instructed him to play several recordings during the meeting. The attorney pressed a button. Richard's voice immediately filled the room. It was calm, clear, and unmistakable. Hearing it caused several people to freeze. In the recording, Richard spoke about loyalty, kindness, and trust. He said that true character reveals itself when no audience is present. He then began describing situations he had personally witnessed over the years. He recalled employees who treated service workers with respect. He mentioned relatives who only appeared when financial matters were involved. He described moments of generosity that had never been shared publicly. With every example, the room grew more uncomfortable. No names were mentioned yet, but many people seemed to recognize themselves in his stories. Then Richard addressed a subject that immediately captured everyone's attention. He spoke about a person who had consistently volunteered time without seeking recognition. A person who had visited community centers, assisted struggling families, and helped organize charitable projects without ever requesting credit. Several relatives looked around the table, trying to identify who he meant. Naomi remained perfectly still. Richard continued. He explained that this individual had repeatedly refused gifts, favors, and financial rewards. According to the recording, that person had demonstrated something far more valuable than business talent or social status. They had demonstrated genuine compassion. The recording ended. Silence filled the conference room. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. She demanded to know who Richard had been describing. Benjamin looked down at the remaining documents in front of him. His expression remained professional, but there was a noticeable seriousness in his eyes. He informed everyone that the answer appeared in the final section of Richard's instructions. Then he reached for the last sealed document in the folder and slowly unfolded the first page. Benjamin looked around the conference room one final time before reading the last document. Every face was fixed on him. Margaret sat perfectly still. Ethan appeared tense. Several relatives leaned forward in anticipation. Naomi could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and little else. Then Benjamin began. Richard's written statement explained that throughout the final years of his life, he had intentionally placed people in situations where they could reveal their true character. He wrote that success had taught him an important lesson. Intelligence could build wealth, but character determined whether that wealth created something meaningful. He continued by describing dozens of moments that had never been discussed publicly. He mentioned volunteers who arrived early and left late. He described quiet acts of kindness performed when no cameras were present. Then he finally identified the individual from the recording. Benjamin read the name slowly and clearly. Naomi Carter. The room froze. For a brief moment, nobody seemed to breathe. Naomi felt every eye turn toward her. Margaret's expression hardened with disbelief. One cousin actually laughed softly as if assuming there had been a mistake. Benjamin continued without reacting. Richard explained that Naomi had participated in community programs for years without requesting compensation. She had spent weekends helping organize educational events, collecting supplies for struggling families, and supporting projects that carried the Whitmore name without ever seeking personal recognition. More importantly, Richard wrote that she had repeatedly declined private financial assistance he had offered. According to the document, he had tested her integrity several times. Each time, Naomi chose service over personal gain. Murmurs spread around the table. Ethan stared at Naomi as if seeing her for the first time. Benjamin then removed another page from the folder. This page contained a personal letter addressed specifically to the family. Richard wrote that many people had assumed Naomi wanted access to wealth. The truth, he said, was exactly the opposite. She was the only person who consistently acted the same whether she was standing inside a mansion or inside a community center. He stated that trust was earned through actions, not bloodlines. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Margaret's face grew pale. Then Benjamin revealed the next instruction. Richard explained that months before his death he had entrusted Naomi with a key connected to an important responsibility. At those words, Naomi instinctively touched her purse. The attorney looked directly at her and asked whether she still possessed the key. Slowly, Naomi nodded. Benjamin smiled for the first time that afternoon. He informed the room that the key opened a secured archive containing records, plans, and directives Richard considered essential to his legacy. The room erupted with questions. Margaret demanded to know why such a responsibility had been given to Naomi instead of family members. Benjamin raised a hand for silence and returned to the document. Richard had anticipated that exact reaction. His answer was written plainly on the page. He said that trust could not be inherited. It had to be earned. Then came the sentence that left the room completely silent once again. Richard declared that the person he trusted most to protect the future of his charitable mission was Naomi Carter. And according to the final section of his instructions, her role in his legacy was only beginning to be revealed. The conference room remained silent as Benjamin Foster reached the final pages of Richard Whitmore's instructions. No one interrupted. No one seemed willing to risk breaking the tension that had settled over the room. Benjamin explained that Richard's charitable mission had never been a side project. It had been the purpose he valued most during the final chapter of his life. The businesses had created wealth, but the community programs had created meaning. According to the documents, Richard had established a private foundation years earlier with long-term plans extending decades into the future. He had funded scholarships, housing assistance programs, educational centers, and community outreach initiatives throughout the state. Most family members had known the foundation existed. Few understood its true scale. Benjamin then revealed the final provision. Richard had appointed Naomi Carter as the chairperson and primary steward responsible for overseeing the future direction of the foundation. The position came with authority, responsibility, and access to the archive plans secured within the box. Connected to the key. A wave of disbelief moved through the room. Margaret immediately objected. She argued that Naomi was not a Whitmore by blood and had no right to such responsibility. Benjamin calmly responded that the appointment had been reviewed, documented, and legally finalized months before Richard's death. There was no uncertainty and no avenue for dispute. Richard's decision was binding. Naomi sat motionless. She had expected answers. She had never expected this. Benjamin continued reading Richard's final words. In the letter, Richard explained that every major decision had been based on trust. He wrote that many people assumed legacy meant passing wealth to the next generation. He disagreed. Legacy meant passing values to the person most willing to protect them. Richard acknowledged that some family members would feel disappointed. He acknowledged that others might feel angry. Yet he remained convinced that character mattered more than entitlement. Then came the final passage. Richard addressed Naomi directly. He thanked her for every hour she had spent helping others when nobody was watching. He thanked her for treating people with dignity regardless of status. Most importantly, he thanked her for never changing who she was despite years of judgment and exclusion. Naomi felt tears forming as Benjamin read the last sentence aloud. Richard wrote that true worth is revealed when a person continues choosing kindness even after receiving none in return. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Family members quietly gathered their belongings. No one seemed certain what to say. Some left immediately. Others avoided eye contact. Margaret walked from the room without speaking. Ethan remained behind. For several moments he stood silently before approaching Naomi. His expression carried regret, disappointment, and understanding all at once. He admitted that he should have defended her. He admitted that he had allowed doubt to influence him. Naomi listened without anger. The past few weeks had taught her something important. Not every apology can erase a wound, but some can begin healing one. Later that evening, Naomi drove to Whitmore Community House. The sun was setting behind the building as children laughed on the basketball court outside. She carried the wooden box beneath one arm and the brass key in her hand. Standing there, she finally understood what Richard had been trying to leave behind. It was never about money. It was never about status. It was never about winning against the people who had doubted her. The real inheritance was trust. The real inheritance was purpose. And as Naomi unlocked the future Richard had carefully prepared, she realized that the doors which had once closed behind her had ultimately led her somewhere far more valuable than wealth. They had led her to the life she was meant to build.
Before the story ends, take a moment to think about the lesson of the video. How many people spend their life trying to be accepted by those who have already decided not to understand them? She never tried to prove her worth through wealth, status, or power. She simply remained kind, honest, and patient. And in the end, that is exactly what Richard Whitmore saw. The truth is, life often places in the room that we feel invisible. Sometimes we're judged by our background, our appearance, our accent, our mistake, or just because we don't fit in someone else's expectation. The people who mock kindness always underestimate its strength. They chase the power and often forget that influence faded. People who measure value by money often forget the most valuable thing in their life. Richard's final gift was never really about wealth. It's about recognition. It was about seeing the one person who stayed genuine when everyone was focused on inheriting. Maybe that is a lesson that's staying hidden in this story. Not everyone applaud you, believe in you. Not everyone ignoring you, fail to see you. Sometimes the person who truly understands your worth is watching you from the background. Your value does not decrease when someone fails to recognize it. Keep showing your kindness, keep showing your integrity, and be a person that you are proud to be. Because one day, the truth about who you are will speak louder than any opinion that ever could. And when that day comes, you won't need to prove anything to anyone. Thanks for watching.